Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on something, well, huge. We're going back, way back, over 3,000 years. We want to really dig into what happens when a whole interconnected world, basically the first global civilization, just collapses. We're zeroing in on 1177 BC.
Yeah, 1177 BC. It's this pivotal moment. You see this sudden, really catastrophic failure of almost every major power across the Mediterranean and the Near East. We're talking the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece, the big trading hubs in Canaan, Cyprus. They all just crumble. It wasn't just one kingdom failing, it was the entire system.
And the sheer scale of it, that's what makes this deep dive so crucial, right? I mean, for centuries before this, these empires were intertwined. They traded, they fought, they had complex diplomacy. It really was the first globalized economy, in a way. And then, poof, gone.
Yeah.
The sources we have, they paint this incredibly bleak picture of what came next, the Dark Age. The language used is stark. You get quotes like, resistance was futile. The great powers of the day fell one by one. And even more fundamentally, it was as if civilization itself had been wiped away in much of this region. It sounds almost apocalyptic.
It does, and that imagery really underlines what we're trying to do here. You know, for a long time, the go-to explanation was simple. Invaders. These mysterious groups called the Sea Peoples just swept through and destroyed everything.
Right, the convenient villains.
Exactly. But modern research paints a much more complicated picture, and frankly, a more alarming one. We're here to unpack this collapse not as just a war, but as a true systems collapse.
Systems collapse. That's the key idea for today, isn't it? We're moving beyond that simple single-cause story. We need to explore how the inherent weaknesses of this incredibly connected world ran headfirst into a perfect storm of external pressures.
That's it, precisely. It was a convergence, a pileup of cascading crises. You had climate change leading to drought. You had economies failing, internal rebellions, maybe even earthquakes. And the crucial part is these factors didn't just add up. They magnified each other. Each problem made the others 10 times worse.
A multiplier effect.
Absolutely. That's what brought the whole thing down. Okay, so to really get a sense of the trauma, the scale of this loss, you first have to appreciate what existed before the collapse. What was the system that failed? Let's look back a bit earlier to the 15th, maybe 14th centuries BC. This is often called the Late Bronze Age, Golden Age.
Right. This is when things were really humming.
Exactly. It was an era of incredibly dynamic international relations.
You read the letters exchanged between rulers, the Amarna letters, for instance, and it's astonishing. Kings calling each other brother, intricate gift exchanges, demands for tribute, managing these complex supply lines for things like metals and timber. It sounds surprisingly modern.
It really does. The level of sophistication is remarkable. You had deep cultural links, military alliances, diplomatic missions crisscrossing the whole region, from Greece all the way to Mesopotamia. Egypt was sort of the superpower, the anchor of the system, but its power had this interesting dual nature. Well, take Queen Hatshepsut in the 15th century. Her reign seems really focused on, let's say, soft power, diplomatic outreach, huge trade expeditions, like the famous one to the land of Punt, probably somewhere down the Red Sea coast. These weren't just about goods, they were about projecting Egypt's reach and prestige, connecting with the Asian world, with Africa. Power through prosperity.
Okay, so diplomacy and trade were central.
Yes, but then you contrast that almost immediately with Thutmose III, her successor, pure military might. His campaigns, especially the decisive Battle of Megiddo around 1479 BC, were about reasserting hard Egyptian controls over strategic territories. Canaan, parts of Syria, pushing back against rivals like the Mitanni.
So it's like Egypt had two gears. Diplomacy when possible, force when necessary.
Precisely, and that flexible balance, that ability to project both economic influence and overwhelming military power, that's what provided the stability needed for these incredibly long-distance trade networks to flourish.
And we have concrete proof of just how far those connections went, right? Especially towards Greece.
Oh, absolutely. Some of the most compelling evidence comes from the reign of Amenhotep III in the 14th century BC. It's an artifact known as the Aegean List. It was found inscribed on the base of one of his statues at his mortuary temple.
Ah, yes. This is a fascinating piece of evidence, partly because of its own troubled history.
It really is. This list contained the names of 15 different Aegean locations. And these weren't generic terms. They were specific place names like Mycenae, Nauplion on the Greek mainland, Knossos on Crete, places that had never appeared in Egyptian records before.
So this wasn't just some vague awareness of people across the sea. This implies direct contact.
Exactly. It suggests a much more formal, maybe even structured relationship. Was it diplomatic recognition, a list of key trading partners, maybe even places visited by Egyptian envoys? We don't know the exact nature, but it points to a robust connection between the height of Egyptian power under Amenhotep III and the powerful Mycenaean palace centers in Greece.
And the tragedy you hinted at.
Well, the original statue base itself, the one with the inscription, was actually destroyed sometime in the 1970s. Lost. Oh, no.
Yeah. So what we know comes from earlier copies, drawings, and painstaking reconstruction work by scholars. It makes those surviving names incredibly precious. They're one of our few direct textual windows into Egypt's foreign policy towards the agent at that specific moment. Every recovered fragment is vital.
It really underscores how fragile historical evidence can be.
It does. But beyond these formal lists, the physical evidence for this globalization is abundant too. You find Minoan-style frescoes painted in Egyptian palaces, huge amounts of Cypriot and Mycenaean pottery turning up in Egyptian tombs and settlements. Egyptian texts mention ships from Keftiu, which most scholars identify with Crete.
So goods, people, ideas, all moving across the sea.
Absolutely. Luxury items, yes, but also essential raw materials, artistic styles, probably even people, craftsmen, merchants, maybe mercenaries. It was building this vast, complex, and deeply interdependent economic and cultural sphere. Okay, so we've established this vibrant, interconnected world during the Golden Age. But if that interconnectedness was its strength, it also seems like it was its greatest weakness. And there's one specific discovery that embodies this fragility perfectly, right? The Uluburun shipwreck.
Oh, the Uluburun wreck it's just astonishing. It's the smoking gun, the tangible proof of everything we've been talking about. It sank off the coast of what's now Turkey, probably around 1300 BC, right in the middle of this era.
And the cargo. It wasn't just a few pots and pans.
Not even close. This ship was carrying a staggering amount of raw materials and finished goods from all over the known world. It's like a snapshot of the entire Bronze Age economy. Its discovery didn't just confirm trade existed, it forced scholars to completely rethink the scale and the level of organization involved.
What was on it? What made it so significant?
Okay, get this. The main cargo was raw metal, the ingredients for bronze. 10 tons of copper ingots, most likely from Cyprus.
10 tons. That's a lot of copper.
It's an enormous amount, enough to equip a small army, and alongside it, about 1 ton of tin ingots.
Tin, the really crucial rare ingredient for bronze.
Exactly. And tin sources were scarce in the Mediterranean. This tin likely came from a very long way away, maybe Central Asia, like modern Afghanistan, or possibly even further west, maybe Cornwall or somewhere in Europe. It had to be mined, processed, and then shipped thousands of miles to reach the workshops in the Asia or the Near East.
So this single ship was carrying the essential ingredients for the defining technology of the age.
Correct. Without both copper and tin, you don't get bronze. No bronze means no tools, no weapons, no statues, none of the things that defined power and prestige. This ship wasn't just carrying trade goods, it was carrying strategic resources vital for multiple kingdoms.
Wait, hang on. Are you saying the vital tin supply, the thing everyone needed, might have been concentrated on just a few voyages like this? That seems incredibly risky.
It was incredibly risky. But that centralization, probably managed at a state level, must have offered huge efficiencies and profits when things were stable. Think of the logistics involved. This wasn't just random merchants. This cargo was likely a royal shipment, maybe tribute, maybe a state-sponsored trade venture.
Okay, so beyond the metals.
Oh, the diversity is amazing. You had raw glass ingots, probably from Mesopotamia or Egypt, ebony logs from Nubia down south in Africa, hundreds of Canaanite jars, probably filled with things like terebinth resin used for incense and perfume, maybe wine, oils, other foodstuffs. There were Baltic amber beads, elephant tusks, ostrich eggshells.
Wow.
And finished goods, too. Cypriot pottery, Mycenaean weapons, Egyptian jewelry, including a unique gold scarab with the name of Queen Nefertiti on it.
Nefertiti. So that helps date it pretty accurately.
It does, to the mid-14th century BC, or slightly later for the scarab itself, though the ship sank around 1300 BC. The point is, the goods came from at least 7 distinct cultures or regions. It's a floating museum of late Bronze Age international relations.
It's literally a microcosm of their entire world, sunk to the bottom of the sea.
Precisely. And its loss. Imagine the economic shock. We don't know how it sank a storm, seems likely. Maybe piracy, maybe just bad navigation. But the result was the same. It wasn't just the monetary value, which was immense. It was the loss of those strategic materials. It was potentially a diplomatic failure if it was a royal gift exchange gone wrong.
So the very interconnectedness that created the wealth also created this massive vulnerability.
Exactly. As the sources say, its discovery forced scholars to completely alter modern scholars' thoughts about the scale of contact. It revealed a world deeply interconnected of trade, migration, diplomacy, and alas, war. That tight interdependence was the engine of the Golden Age, but it also meant that when one part of the system started to fray, the whole thing was threatened. The Uluburun wreck is a stark reminder of the risk inherent in that complex system long before the final collapse.
Okay, so the system was complex, interconnected, and clearly vulnerable, as the Uluburun shows. As we move closer to that 1177 BC date into the 13th and early 12th centuries BC, do we see those vulnerabilities starting to show? Does the system begin to creak?
Oh, absolutely. The stability of the Golden Age definitely starts to erode. The geopolitical tensions that were maybe managed or kept in check earlier begin to flare up much more seriously.
Like the big showdowns between the major powers.
Exactly. The famous Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BC between the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II, is a prime example. It was this massive chariot battle, probably one of the largest ever fought. And while it technically ended in a stalemate and led to the world's first surviving peace treaty,
Which is incredible in itself.
it is. But the battle itself and the decades of tension leading up to it highlighted the constant draining rivalry between the two superpowers, maintaining huge armies, campaigning far from home that requires enormous resources, logistical effort, manpower. It puts a strain on the entire system.
And we also hear whispers of trouble elsewhere, right? Maybe connecting to things like the Trojan War legend.
Yes, the Hittite texts mention ongoing problems and conflicts in Western Anatolia, particularly involving a place called Wilusa. Most scholars now strongly suspect Wilusa is the Hittite name for Troy, or Ilion. There are references to Mycenaean Greek involvement, or Ahiawa, as the Hittites called them, in these conflicts. So you're seeing friction not just between the big empires, but potentially drawing in the Mycenaean kingdoms, too. The network is showing signs of stress, localized conflicts are bubbling up.
But then things seem to escalate dramatically, moving from localized stress to outright collapse in key areas.
That's right. The real shockwave seems to hit in the early 12th century BC, roughly between 1190 and 1185 BC. This is when we see the sudden, violent destruction of major, prosperous cities that were central to the trade network. The prime example is Ugarit.
Ugarit on the Syrian coast. We mentioned it as a hub.
A crucial hub. It was perfectly positioned between the Mediterranean sea routes and the overland routes to Mesopotamia. It exported valuable goods, timber, purple dye, textiles, metalwork. Its merchants had connections everywhere. Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, the Hittite heartland, Assyria. It was globalization in action.
And what makes Ugarit's fall so chilling
Right.
is the evidence found in the city, right? The archives.
Exactly. Archaeologists discovered extensive archives of clay tablets, diplomatic letters, economic records, school texts, literature right in the administrative buildings. And some of these tablets were literally found in the kilns, presumably being baked for preservation when the destruction hit.
So life was yelling on, business as usual, right up until the very end.
It seems that way. But some of the very last letters paint a picture of growing panic. There are desperate messages mentioning enemy ships sighted off the coast, pleas for help from allies, orders to mobilize defenses. You can feel the imminent threat. And then fire, widespread destruction. The city was violently overthrown, burned, and essentially abandoned. It never recovered its former importance. Whoever attacked, they did a thorough job.
A major node in the network.
Yeah.
Just gone.
Snuffed out. And critically, Ugarit wasn't alone. This wasn't just one city having a bad day. Around the same time, we see similar destruction layers, evidence of intense fires, conflict, abandonment at sites right across the eastern Mediterranean.
Where else?
Major Canaanite cities like Hazor, Lachish, Megiddo show destruction. Sites in Cyprus like Enkomi and Kishan suffer violence. Further inland, places like Imar on the Euphrates are destroyed. Bir Alala in the Jordan Valley, Akko on the coast. The pattern is too widespread, too simultaneous to just localized warfare or accidents. It points towards a systemic crisis.
So who is doing all this destroying if it's happening everywhere at once?
That's the million-dollar question. As one scholar put it, looking at this broad picture, it is far from clear who or what was responsible. Which brings us back, inevitably, to the Sea Peoples. Their major confrontation with Egypt under Ramses III, traditionally dated to 1177 BC, seems to cap off this period of intense destruction.
Right, the Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu are dramatic. Ramses III portrays them as this unstoppable confederation arriving by land and sea, overwhelming everything in their path.
He does. He lists various groups within this coalition, names like Peliset, often linked to the Philistines, Checker, Shekelish, Denyen, Weshesh. He describes how they had already desolated lands like the Hittite kingdom, Cyprus, and parts of Syria before reaching Egypt's borders. He boasts of a massive victory both on land in Syria and in a major naval battle in the Nile Delta. His inscriptions are quite graphic. Those who reach my frontier, their seed is not. Their heart and soul are finished forever and ever. Strong stuff.
Egypt survived then. They held the line.
They did. Egypt technically won the battle. But the consensus among historians is that it was a Pyrrhic victory. The cost of mobilizing to fight off this massive invasion, combined with the disruption already happening across the region, severely weakened the Egyptian state. The New Kingdom, Egypt's imperial phase, essentially ends around this time. Egypt was never the same again. It entered a long period of decline and internal division. The victory cost them dearly.
Okay, but who are these Sea Peoples? If they weren't just a single invading force, what's the current thinking?
The thinking has shifted significantly. The Egyptian reliefs show them traveling not just as warriors, but with carts, families, women, and children. This looks more like a migration than a purely military expedition.
Like displaced people, refugees.
Right. Exactly. Many scholars now believe the Sea Peoples weren't the primary cause of the collapse, but rather a major symptom or consequence of it. They were likely diverse groups from across the Aegean and Mediterranean, maybe Mycenaeans, fleeing collapsing palace centers, Anatolians escaping famine, Sardinians, Sicilians, others who were themselves casualties of broader catastrophic events.
What kind of events?
Drought, famine, earthquakes, internal warfare in their own homelands. They were pushed out, displaced, and forced to move, looking for new places to settle.
But if they were refugees, why were they such effective fighters? Ramses III clearly saw them as a massive military threat.
Desperation is a powerful motivator. And these weren't just random farmers. If you have groups like displaced Mycenaean warriors, people with military training and equipment suddenly finding themselves landless and starving, they could absolutely become a formidable, opportunistic force. They might have banded together, used their military skills to raid and conquer new territories simply to survive. They were likely leveraging the chaos and weakness that already existed in the places they attacked.
So they were both victims and aggressors, in a way, a product of the collapse, but also accelerating it.
That seems much closer to the reality. They weren't the single bullet, but they were pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. Their movements added another layer of complexity and violence to an already crumbling system. So putting it all together, the key takeaway from 1177 BC and the surrounding chaos is this. Forget monocausality. Forget blaming just the Sea Peoples, or just climate change, or just earthquakes.
It wasn't one thing.
Definitely not. It was the convergence, the perfect storm, the way all these different factors interacted and amplified each other. That's the core of understanding it as a system's collapse.
Okay, let's break down those main ingredients in the storm again. First, the big environmental driver. Climate change and famine.
Right. The evidence for significant prolonged climate change hitting the eastern Mediterranean and Near East around this time is now very strong. We're talking about a shift towards much drier conditions.
How do we know that? What's the proof?
It comes from multiple lines of evidence. Pollen analysis from lake sediments shows changes in vegetation. Oxygen isotope studies in cave stalagmites track rainfall patterns. Analysis of ancient river flows and sea levels. There's also evidence like dust layers in sediment cores suggesting more arid, windy conditions. The overall picture points to a multi-decade period of severe drought across the region.
And the impact.
Devastating, especially for the big, centralized empires that relied on large-scale, rain-fed agriculture or predictable river floods like the Hittites or the Mycenaeans. Reduced rainfall means crop failures. Crop failures mean food shortages. Food shortages mean famine.
We have direct evidence of famine.
We do. Hittite texts from the final years of the empire contain desperate pleas to Egypt, asking for emergency grain shipments to avert starvation. It seems the Hittite heartland in Anatolia was hit particularly hard. When the state can't feed its people, its legitimacy collapses. You get social unrest, people abandoning settlements, internal conflict over scarce resources.
And potentially people being forced to move elsewhere, like the Sea Peoples.
Exactly. Widespread, prolonged famine is probably the single most powerful driver for large-scale population movements in the pre-modern world. Climate change likely provided the initial massive push for migrations like those associated with the sea peoples.
Okay, so drought and famine are weakening states, causing unrest, forcing migration. What else is in this toxic mix? Earthquakes.
Yes, geological hazards seem to play a role too. There's a compelling theory supported by archaeological evidence suggesting a period of unusually high seismic activity. An earthquake storm struck the region between roughly 1225 and 1175 BC.
An earthquake storm, like multiple major quakes.
Potentially. At numerous sites across Greece, Crete, Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Levant, archaeologists have found destruction layers from this period that look very much like earthquake-damaged collapsed walls, characteristic patterns of debris.
You mentioned Ugarit earlier. Was it hit too?
Ugarit shows signs consistent with earthquake damage before its final destruction by fire. Same for major Mycenaean centers like Mycenae itself, Tiryns, and Thebes.
But cities can be rebuilt after earthquakes.
Right. They can, and sometimes they were, at least partially. We see evidence of rebuilding attempts at some sites. But imagine trying to rebuild your city walls or your palace after a major quake when you're also dealing with severe drought, food shortages, disruption to trade routes, and potentially hostile groups moving through the area.
The resources just wouldn't be there.
Exactly. The physical damage from earthquakes would have massively compounded the existing stresses. Repairing monumental architecture, restoring irrigation systems that require stability, resources, manpower, things that were rapidly disappearing. So earthquakes likely contributed significantly to the weakening and final abandonment of many centers, even if they weren't the sole cause.
Okay, drought, famine, earthquakes. What about problems from within? Internal strife.
Absolutely critical. When the external pressures mount, the internal cohesion of these societies starts to break down. When the central authority, the palace, the king can no longer guarantee food supplies, security from attack, or the functioning of the economy, people lose faith. Internal divisions, local power struggles, even outright rebellion become much more likely.
Do we see evidence of that?
It's often harder to prove definitively than, say, a burn layer. But yes, there are hints. Take the Palace of Nestor at Pylos in southwestern Greece. It was destroyed by a massive fire around 1200 BC. The linear B tablets found there, baked hard by the fire, are fascinating.
What do they say?
They record frantic, last-minute preparations, sacrifices to the gods, deployment of watchers along the coast, distribution of bronze to smiths, presumably to make weapons or repair armor.
Sounds like they were expecting an attack.
They clearly were. But the tablets don't explicitly name an external enemy. Some scholars interpret the preparations as defense against seaborne raiders, maybe early waves of sea peoples. But others wonder if the threat was internal. Could the palace have been destroyed by its own oppressed subjects, resentful of the elite hoarding resources during a time of hardship? The ambiguity itself is significant.
And Hazor, in Canaan, you mentioned that earlier.
Yes. The massive final destruction of late Bronze Age Hazor is another case where internal rebellion is a strong possibility, perhaps driven by the subject Canaanite population rising up against the ruling elite.
So the system is failing from the outside and the inside.
Precisely. And all of this is underpinned by the fourth factor, economic disintegration. Go back to the Uluburun ship. That ship represented the complex supply chains that held the whole system together, especially for strategic goods like metals.
When those routes break down,
The consequences are catastrophic. If the tin supply from Central Asia is disrupted by conflict or instability along the overland routes, or if the sea lanes become too dangerous for ships carrying Cypriot copper due to piracy or collapsing states, then the bronze industry grinds to a halt.
no bronze, no power.
Pretty much. No new weapons for armies, no tools for agriculture or construction, no prestige goods for the elite to maintain their status. This economic breakdown fuels social unrest, weakens military capacity, makes states even more vulnerable to drought or attack. It's a vicious cycle. So you have climate change causing famine, famine causing unrest and migration, earthquakes adding physical destruction, internal strife weakening defenses, and the collapse of trade crippling the economy. All hitting at roughly the same time. That's the perfect storm. That's systems collapse.
It's a terrifying picture.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, is there a general rule here? Why do complex societies become so vulnerable that multiple crises can just wipe them out?
That's a huge question, and it takes us into the broader theory of societal collapse. Why do civilizations fail? One really influential idea comes from the anthropologist Joseph Tainter. He looked at numerous historical collapses and proposed a fascinating, almost counterintuitive explanation.
Which is?
Basically, Tainter argues that societies don't collapse because they're weak or decadent or immoral. They often collapse because they become too complex.
Too complex. How can complexity be bad? We usually think of it as a sign of advancement.
And initially it is. Developing things like writing, bureaucracy, large-scale irrigation, standing armies, complex trade networks, these increase a society's ability to solve problems, extract resources, and grow. That's investment in complexity.
Okay, makes sense.
But, Tainter argues, investing in complexity yields diminishing returns over time. As a society faces new challenges, environmental stress, population growth, external threats, its typical response is to become more complex.
Yeah.
It adds more layers of bureaucracy, builds bigger fortifications, develops more elaborate technologies or rituals, expands its military.
Trying to solve the problem by adding more systems.
Exactly. But each new layer of complexity requires more energy, more resources, more administrative overhead to maintain. And crucially, each new investment yields progressively smaller benefits compared to the earlier, simpler solutions.
Can you give a Bronze Age example of that diminishing return?
Think about securing that vital tin supply we talked about. Initially, establishing the trade route might have brought huge benefits, enabling bronze production on a massive scale. But as the routes become less stable, maybe due to conflict further east, the kingdoms don't just give up on tin, they have to invest more complexity. Maybe sending diplomatic missions, paying higher prices, providing military escorts for caravans or ships, creating new bureaucratic departments to manage the increasingly difficult logistics. The cost and resources, manpower, administration of getting that same amount of tin keeps going up and up. The marginal return on that investment keeps dropping.
Until
Until eventually, the cost of maintaining that level of complexity, the huge palace administration, the army, the long-distance trade apparatus, the monumental building projects, simply outweighs the benefits it provides to the majority of the population. The system becomes too burdensome, too costly to sustain, especially when hit by external shocks like drought or invasion.
So collapse, in Tainter's view, isn't necessarily a catastrophe for everyone. It can be seen as a rational, though often traumatic, process of simplification.
In a way, yes. Collapse means a rapid decrease in complexity. Centralized government disappears, trade networks vanish, literacy might be lost, populations decline or disperse, monumental building stops. Society reverts to a simpler, less energy-intensive, more localized form of organization because the highly complex structure is no longer sustainable.
And the late Bronze Age collapse fits this model perfectly.
It really seems to. You had this incredibly complex, tightly interwoven system of palace economies, international diplomacy, specialized craft production, long-distance trade, highly centralized, highly resource-intensive. When hit by multiple simultaneous crises, the cost of maintaining that complexity skyrocketed beyond its benefits. The whole interdependent structure unraveled.
Which brings in that idea of interdependence being a vulnerability again. Renfrew's model.
Right. Colin Renfrew, another archaeologist, emphasized how in highly integrated systems like the late Bronze Age world, the fates of the different parts are linked. Because they were so dependent on each other for raw materials, markets, grain, political stability, a crisis in one area, like a drought hitting the Hittites or the Mycenaean palaces falling, didn't just affect that one area. It triggered what Renfrew called a domino and multiplier effect. The failure of one component sends shockwaves through the entire network, potentially causing cascading failures elsewhere.
If Egypt couldn't export grain, or Cyprus couldn't export copper,
then kingdoms relying on those imports were immediately in trouble. The tight coupling that allowed for efficiency in good times made the system incredibly brittle when bad times hit.
and the archaeological evidence shows that rapid simplification clearly.
Absolutely. The hallmarks of the collapse are precisely those things Tainter and Renfrew describe. The breakdown of central administration, palaces burn, archives end, the disappearance of the elite class, no more rich burials, luxury goods vanish, economic disintegration, trade stops, specialized crafts disappear, and major demographic shifts. Cities abandoned, population moves to rural areas, overall numbers likely drop. It's a textbook case of systems collapse driven by overcomplexity meeting multiple crises.
It's sobering stuff. And the scary part is, this pattern doesn't seem unique to the Bronze Age. When we look at other major civilizational collapses throughout history, do we see similar dynamics at play?
We absolutely do. The combination of environmental stress, internal vulnerabilities often linked to complexity, and the interconnectedness of systems seems to be a recurring theme. It serves as a powerful, if grim, set of historical case studies.
Where else do we see this? The Maya.
The classic Maya collapse, roughly between 800 and 1000 AD, is a fascinating parallel. Here you had this incredibly sophisticated civilization in Mesoamerica, complex city-states, amazing mathematics and astronomy, dense populations supported by intensive agriculture.
And their downfall was linked to climate, too.
Very strongly. Paleoclimate research, looking at things like stalagmite growth rings in caves and in lake sediment analysis, has shown that the Maya heartland experienced several periods of severe, prolonged drought during the 8th and 9th centuries. We're not talking a dry year or two, but multi-decade droughts.
And that hit their food supply hard.
Critically hard. The Maya population had grown significantly, relying heavily on intensive agriculture, particularly maize monoculture. Maize is very productive, but it's also very vulnerable to drought. When the rains failed consistently, their agricultural system, the foundation of their complex society, started to collapse.
And like the Bronze Age, there were self-inflicted wounds, too, making the environmental problems worse.
Yes, it seems so. To support the large populations and build their incredible monumental cities, the Maya engaged in widespread deforestation, clearing forests for farmland and, significantly, burning vast amounts of wood to make the lime plaster they used to coat their temples and pyramids.
Deforestation leading to
soil erosion, reduced water retention in the landscape, possibly even localized changes in rainfall patterns. It basically made the environment less resilient to the droughts when they arrived. The complexity of their society, requiring massive resource extraction, undermined its own environmental foundation.
And the result?
Increased competition and warfare between the city-states over dwindling resources, breakdown of political authority, and ultimately the abandonment of the major urban centers. People didn't disappear, but the complex societal structure did. They shifted towards smaller, more dispersed rural settlements, a dramatic reduction in complexity, mirroring the Bronze Age aftermath.
Okay, what about the big one, Rome? The fall of the Western Roman Empire. Is that a similar story?
Rome is maybe the ultimate example of Tainter's diminishing returns on complexity, although it was a much slower, longer collapse than the Bronze Age one.
It wasn't just barbarians at the gates then.
That was part of it, but more a symptom than the root cause. Rome's internal structure was becoming unsustainable long before the final fall in the 5th century AD. Economically, the empire was groaning under its own weight. Maintaining the massive army needed to defend vast frontiers, plus the sprawling bureaucracy, required crushing levels of taxation. At the same time, they were constantly debasing their currency, reducing the silver content in coins, leading to rampant inflation and loss of faith in the economic system.
So the costs of complexity were becoming unbearable.
Exactly. And reliance on slave labor may have stifled technological innovation in some areas. The system was becoming rigid, expensive, and less productive over time.
And then, did environmental factors kick in here too?
Yes, significantly. The period known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, starting in the 530s AD, brought a period of sustained cooling to the northern hemisphere. This was likely triggered by massive volcanic eruptions. We have ice core evidence for huge eruptions around 536 and 540 AD that threw aerosols into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight.
Resulting in
crop failures, colder temperatures, widespread famine. This environmental shock hit the empire just when it was already economically and militarily fragile.
and disease. Rome's interconnectedness must have played a role there.
A huge role. Rome's vast trade networks, while bringing wealth, also created pathways for disease. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century AD, possibly smallpox, and even more devastatingly, the Plague of Justinian in the mid-6th century AD were catastrophic. The Plague of Justinian was the first major pandemic caused by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. Genetic studies suggest it originated in Central Asia and traveled along the trade routes into the Mediterranean.
So the empire's globalization made it incredibly vulnerable to biological disaster.
Precisely. As one source puts it, the interconnected Roman world was a boon to its microbial inhabitants. Dense urban populations and constant movement of goods and people allowed the plague to spread like wildfire. Estimates suggest it killed a huge percentage of the population, maybe up to 50% in some areas. It decimated the army, shattered the tax base, and crippled the administration. It was a biological hammer blow to an already weakened system. The cost of maintaining Roman complexity became impossible.
One more example. The Indus Valley civilization. Much earlier, but renowned for its sophistication. Did climate get them too?
It looks like it. The Indus Valley Civilization, with its amazing planned cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, flourished from around 2600 BC. But it underwent a significant transformation and decline after 1900 BC. For a long time, the reasons were debated: invasion, internal decay. But recent high-resolution climate research, again using stalagmites, this time from the Himalayas, has provided a compelling environmental explanation.
What did they find?
Evidence for a series of 3 severe, prolonged droughts hitting the region starting around 4,200 years ago, or 2200 BCE. And these weren't short droughts. Each lasted for decades, 25 to 90 years long. Critically, they seem to have affected both the summer monsoon rains, vital for main crops like wheat and barley, and the winter rainfall. A double whammy.
So, a sustained environmental crisis. How did the Indus civilization respond? Was it a violent collapse like the Bronze Age?
Interestingly, it seems different. While the sophisticated urban phase ended, there isn't widespread evidence for violent destruction or conquest correlating exactly with this period. Instead, it looks more like an adaptation, a strategic retreat from complexity.
How so?
The population seems to have deliberately moved away from the large, water-intensive megacities in the core region. There was a shift towards smaller, more dispersed rural settlements, often in areas better suited to withstand drought. Archaeobotanical evidence also shows a shift in agriculture towards more drought-resistant crops, like millets.
So they adapted by simplifying.
It appears so. They managed the environmental stress by decentralizing, adopting more resilient farming strategies, and moving towards a less complex, more self-reliant rural way of life. The civilization, as defined by its urban complexity, collapsed, but the people and culture persisted in a different form. It's a fascinating case of adaptation through decomplexification.
Looking at all these examples, the Bronze Age, the Maya, Rome, the Indus, the parallels are striking and, frankly, a bit unnerving for us today.
They absolutely should be. We live in arguably the most complex, tightly interconnected global system history has ever known. Our reliance on global supply chains, intricate financial networks, and stable climate patterns dwarfs anything these ancient civilizations experienced.
And we're facing our own potential perfect storm scenarios, aren't we?
Yeah.
Climate change is undeniable. We see resource scarcity issues. Economic instability seems baked into the system. Geopolitical tensions are high.
We are. The fundamental vulnerabilities seem disturbingly similar. The study of these past collapses isn't just ancient history, it's a series of stark warnings about the fragility of complex systems when faced with multiple compounding stressors.
So what's the key lesson? If complexity itself can be the problem, what do? We can't just decide to become simpler.
No, not easily. But the lessons point towards the critical importance of resilience and adaptive capacity. How flexible is our system? How quickly can it respond to shocks without completely breaking down? The ancient world often failed because its highly centralized, rigid structures couldn't adapt fast enough when conditions changed dramatically.
So things like sustainable resource management become crucial, not pushing the environment past its limits like the Maya perhaps did with deforestation.
Exactly. Understanding planetary boundaries, managing resources sustainably, investing in systems that can absorb shocks, whether environmental, economic, or political.
It's about recognizing that relentless pursuit of ever-increasing complexity and efficiency might come at the cost of resilience. Sometimes redundancy, or appropriate simplicity, as you put it, might be a wiser long-term strategy than maximizing short-term output.
Precisely. Avoiding the trap of diminishing returns on complexity that Tainter identified, ensuring the benefits of our complex systems continue to outweigh the costs, especially the hidden environmental and social costs.
There's one final, really intriguing angle related to the ancient world that connects to this idea of slow, perhaps unexpected change. It relates to the physical environment itself, beyond just climate.
Yes, the changing landscapes. We often think of geography as fixed, but coastlines, rivers, harbors, they were incredibly dynamic in antiquity, and geology played a huge role, sometimes catastrophic, sometimes slow and insidious.
Right. The sources mention how some ancient ports were literally lost beneath the waves due to sudden geological events, like earthquakes causing land subsidence.
Yeah, places like Helike in Greece, submerged by an earthquake and tsunami. Or Kekris, the port of Corinth, where Roman-era harbor structures are now visibly underwater due to fault movements. Quick, dramatic changes.
But then there's the opposite problem, the slow one you mentioned earlier, delta progradation.
This is fascinating, and perhaps even more relevant as a metaphor for slow-burn crises. Delta progradation is the natural process where a river carries sediment downstream and deposits it at its mouth. Over centuries, or sometimes even decades if the sediment load is high, this builds up new land, pushing the coastline further and further out to sea.
And if you're an ancient city built around a harbor near that river mouth.
Your harbor gradually silts up. It becomes shallower, harder for ships to access, and eventually the river builds land right past your expensive harbor installations, leaving them high and dry miles inland.
There's a specific example of this, right? Oinais.
Ancient Oinades in western Greece is the classic case. It was a major port city heavily fortified with impressive shipyards built into bedrock near the mouth of the Achelous River, a significant naval power. But the Achelous carries a huge amount of sediment. Over the centuries, its delta built outwards relentlessly. By Roman times, around the 1st century BC, those impressive Hellenistic shipyards, once on the coast, were already 5 kilometers inland, utterly useless. The city lost its maritime access and declined.
5 kilometers. Just from silt building up over time. No invasion, no earthquake, just slow geological change, rendering critical infrastructure obsolete.
Exactly. A slow-motion disaster that unfolded over generations, probably almost imperceptibly year by year.
So that brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. If these powerful, sophisticated ancient civilizations, the ones that built pyramids and palaces, traded across continents, commanded huge armies, could ultimately fail because they couldn't adapt to slow, relentless, almost invisible changes in their physical environment, like a river delta silting up a vital harbor.
And then what comparable, slow-motion, non-military, perhaps non-obvious disaster might be unfolding in our own hyper-complex, globally interconnected world right now? Something that isn't grabbing headlines today, something largely outside our immediate political focus, but which, over the next few decades or the next century, could fundamentally undermine the foundations of our own infrastructure, our economy, our way of life. Just as surely as that silt buried the port of Oinites, what are we not seeing?